Hey everyone, I wanted to go over the new and exciting news that we got for Monster Hunter Rise thanks to Capcom's fiscal report that they recently put out. This is obviously something that they do once a year when they kind of just tally up all their sales and they end up reporting like how many copies have sold for any specific game within their stable of franchises. And thanks to this brand new fiscal report that they put out, we now know that Monster Hunter Rise has now sold north of 7.3 million units as of June 30th of 2021. This is 2.5 million additional units that have been sold since March 31st. Remember that the game, I believe, launched like March 26th, and within like the first week they sold about 5 million copies. So it did really gangbusters right out of the gate. It was a pretty hype release for the Nintendo Switch. In fact, it was probably one of the best releases on the Nintendo Switch in all of 2021. But with this brand new fiscal update, we now know that 2.5 million additional units have been sold in the subsequent months up until June 30th, which is about a 3-month period. So about, I don't know, 800,000 copies a month or something along those lines, which is extremely good. Obviously, that doesn't include all of July and the half of August that we were already through. So almost a month and a half of sales are still missing from that 7.3 million units sold ratio that they've provided us with. And to contextualize that a bit further, Monster Hunter World has sold 17.3 million copies, so about 10 million more, but that game also had obviously its Iceborne expansion. It also had a multi-platform release, and that game's also been out for, I believe, like 3 to 4 years now. So it's definitely been around the block and is kind of catered to a very separate audience that's a little bit more widespread in different platforms, where Monster Hunter Rise is still just available on the Nintendo Switch, and we're still waiting for that G rank update, which is I'm sure going to be its very own Iceborne type expansion, and of course its potential PC release sometime early next year. So sales are surely to at least double looking forward into the horizon. Whether it ever ends up catching Monster Hunter World or Iceborne's expansion, that's another different conversation that I'm not necessarily willing to have right now, but I do think at the very least it's gonna come very, very close. Now, I do think, to be realistic about it, there have been some issues that have hampered the game's, I guess, sales figures and projections a little bit. It all starts with obviously the lack of physical copies available at launch. This is actually one of the things that Capcom had not to just apologize once, but several and subsequent times after the launch, where physical copies weren't available in stores in Japan and some places in Asia. Even in the United States, physical copies were a little bit slim to get. This is heading into April of earlier in the year, simply because just they didn't print out enough copies for the game. So they were telling people to essentially pick up the game digitally, which a lot of people would presume that it's just a 1-to-1 ratio. You know, if you are looking for the game physically, but they don't necessarily have a copy, so they tell you to go get a digital one. That doesn't mean everyone who wanted a physical copy and is told to go get a digital one instead is going to go ahead and do it. I wouldn't necessarily say that's like a half ratio or even a 75% ratio, but it doesn't translate to a 1-to-1. So even if they had to wait, those people probably just moved on to other games, went on to different and better things, and they didn't necessarily end up picking a copy of Monster Hunter Rise simply because a physical copy wasn't necessarily available. Another thing that's hampered and hindered a little bit, I guess, the sales could be the fact that Monster Hunter Stories 2's release was pretty much right at the heels of Monster Hunter Rise, about a 2 to 3 month difference. And for a lot of people probably who don't necessarily know much about these franchises, they don't necessarily know which one is which one's a spin-off, which one's a main game. They don't necessarily know, so they're probably just like, these games kind of come out like water, I'm just gonna wait for a discount or something like that. So they didn't necessarily decide to pick up Rise because they saw Stories releasing pretty much right next to it. So it could be another reason why sales didn't necessarily flourish as they could have possibly have. And another one of those is just simply that people just wait for discounts, and you've got to remember that Monster Hunter Rise has not received a discount, period. A lot of people on Twitter I've seen, specifically Monster Hunter fans, have been championing Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate on the Nintendo Switch being on the eShop for I believe like 10 to 15 bucks, which is a steal, and you should definitely go pick up that game if you've not actually played it. If you started with Monster Hunter World or even with Monster Hunter Rise, go pick up Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate on the Nintendo Switch on the eShop if you see it on sale for like 10 to 15 bucks. It's a steal. That game is fantastic for what it is. It's very much old school general Monster Hunter stuff. It's not necessarily as fast paced or whatever, but it's still a damn good deal for what you're actually getting for that price, specifically for that price. And that's the biggest point that I want to bring up here, is the fact that Monster Hunter Rise simply has not seen those kind of sales. I do think I've seen the game being sold brand new from like Walmart or Amazon or whatever for around $50 a couple of times, but I've not actually seen the game drop to like 30 to 40 or even like 20 to $15. Like that simply has not happened. So it's one of those situations where right now, if you're looking for like a bargain deal for Monster Hunter Rise, it simply hasn't happened. It's just not the time. And I don't necessarily think Capcom is ready to make that drop off price just yet, because obviously the G rank update's still not out yet. So it's one of those things where like they're not necessarily going to hamper their very own sales by bargain binning the game just now and then, you know, putting out a G rank update or an expansion and then asking people to double dip again or pay for like a full price expansion, or even if it's $40 to $50, simply because they already bargain bin their original game. They're not necessarily going to do that just yet. I would probably expect them to go into the holiday season making probably Monster Hunter Rise and Monster Hunter Stories 2 available for around $40 in the eShop or something along those lines, maybe physical copies as well. I think that seems a little bit more reasonable, but I don't necessarily think you're going to be able to find Monster Hunter Rise heading into the G-Rank update early next year for anything less than like $35 to $40. I just don't think that's going to happen. So ultimately, is Monster Hunter Rise selling as good as it could possibly sell? Probably not. A lot of it has to do with some of the things that I mentioned. Another one has to do with simply just the roadmap. It's been abysmal. It's been one of those things that a lot of people are not necessarily too happy with. And we're just kind of like trudging along through the summer, hoping that it picks up heading into the autumn, which signs aren't necessarily all that positive. So it's one of those things where like, I talked about this very early in, I want to say like April or something, but it was one of those things that I was very much like, I'm not sure what they're actually going to do. Sales could actually eventually dip during the summer months, which are actually where we're in right now, simply because we didn't necessarily know all the details for the DLC. This was even before we got the 3.0 update. I think the 2.0 update dropped around the time that I started to talk about this. And it was very much one of those things where like the DLC and the added content and the brand new monsters being added on is going to really want to dictate how people are willing to like purchase the game, how much they're willing to actually spend money on actually getting involved with it, and it just simply hasn't been there. So I don't necessarily fault people if they're not clamoring to the store to be able to go pick up a copy of Monster Hunter Rise, because it's just simply one of those games that's been not necessarily all that well supported. And the criticisms, a lot of the criticisms at the very least when it comes to in that front of it, have been fair. Is the game bad because of any of that? Absolutely not. That is not the case. But if sales could have been better simply because the roadmap was better, that's absolutely one of those things that I think would have actually helped the sales a little bit more. But hopefully you guys found this information informative. I think that hopefully the game, once the G-Rank update comes out, it rounds out the experience and things get a little bit better going forward, and sales actually get closer to Monster Hunter World type numbers. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya!